G'day, my name's Mark Hudson. I edit a publication called Manchester Climate Monthly, and this video is going to hopefully explain to you a little bit about the history of the climate negotiations at an international level. I'll talk to the camera and I'll probably throw in some pictures and subtitles, but mostly this is just me talking. So, climate scientists have been looking at the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the late 1950s, and oil companies knew that they were doing this. There's publications back as far as 59-60, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and so forth. Other scientists like Edward Teller were warning that this could be a problem, and this has all come out in the last few years. There have been investigations about who knew what when, and it turns out that the oil companies especially knew a lot very early on. But the scientists were quite cautious about how quickly the carbon dioxide would build up in the atmosphere and how long it would take for this to be a problem. And policymakers, politicians, don't listen to scientists until the scientists are coming and saying, hey, this is going to be a problem next Tuesday. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, the politician's not going to be in power after that time, usually. And they're thinking, well, I'll be sat on my beach with my non-executive directorships, I'll kick the can down the road, I'll ignore the science, I won't even listen to the scientist. Things started to change in the mid-1980s, and that was because of the ozone hole, which is a distinct but overlapping in some ways atmospheric problem. And this gave the discovery of the ozone hole in 84, I think it was, gave atmospheric scientists a lot more credibility and a lot more public power, if you will. They were getting in the media more, people were starting to pay attention. Now, the American government didn't like being pushed around as they were. They perceived that they had been on the question of a treaty on ozone, the Vienna Treaty. And so when the issue of climate change popped up, they were quite determined to be able to control the debate a bit better and to be able to put dampeners on some of the scientific enthusiasm. So in the summer of 1988, the whole issue of climate change hit the headlines, and there's various factors for that. One was it was just an incredibly hot year in the United States, and the Mississippi River, which is crucially important for transport within the United States, was at its lowest level for a very long time. And a climate scientist called James Hansen was asked to give some testimony, and on June 23rd, 1988, he came out with his famous statement that it's time to stop waffling and say that the greenhouse effect is here. He said that to some journalists immediately after his testimony. And his testimony was just before a big international conference held in Toronto, and a couple of months later, Margaret Thatcher gave a speech at the Royal Society, repeating what scientists had been saying, which was that we were conducting a giant experiment on the atmosphere. And at the same time, the presidential nominees in the United States, George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, were mentioning at least climate change. And H.W. Bush famously said that people who worry about the greenhouse effect aren't taking into account the White House effect. And Bush promised that if he would become president, he would call an international conference and they would start within a year and they'd start to deal with it. Bush got elected and he didn't do it. And the momentum for climate action was quick, and there were lots of meetings, but no one really knew what to do. And then finally, in beginning of 1991, the negotiations proper started for what would be a United Nations treaty. Now, the interesting thing about that, and many theses have been written, the crucial thing to understand about this is that the Europeans were keen on a treaty that included timetables and targets for emissions reductions. The Americans were even more keen that any treaty did not include that. And the Americans said, well, look, if you insist on that wording in a treaty, we won't turn up, and your precious climate treaty will be as toothless and as non-ratified as the international law of the sea. So there was some diplomacy with the British doing what they always do, which is sort of being the middleman between the Europeans and the Americans, and the Europeans blinked And that's the crucial thing to understand about where we are today in 2019. So the Europeans took the targets and timetables out on the premise that, well, we'll get a baseline treaty, a framework convention, and then we can revisit that issue of targets and timetables. And so it came to pass in June of 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. There were a couple of international conventions signed, the other one's on biodiversity, but we don't really pay any attention to that because we don't perceive all the other species on this planet as mattering much. The climate one has had a bit more traction because I think eventually, or the capitals realise that eventually they're going to be in trouble too, and there's just lots of upward pressure. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, has some motherhood and apple pie words about emissions reductions and a sort of an aspirational target that by the year 2000 the developed countries, meaning the rich countries, of OECD mostly, will have stabilised their emissions at 1990 levels. So that would actually mean a slight reduction because already by 1992 levels were higher. So the UNFCCC treaty had to be ratified by all of the countries that had signed it through their own government process, and I think it was 50 or 60 countries had to have ratified it before it could become law. Now what's a little bit interesting is that process happened quicker than a lot of people thought it would. The Americans ratified it in late 92, as did the Australians. We'll come back to both those countries. So in 1994, enough countries had signed that UNFCCC became international law, and that meant that there had to be the first Conference of the Parties. Now, there have been all sorts of negotiations continuing between Rio and this, but the Conference of the Parties was where the big action was going to be. The first one was held in Berlin in March, April 1995, and for history buffs there was a young former East German minister there by the name of Angela Merkel, who sort of had a chemistry background or physics, I forget which, and she knew what was going on, and you can go back and you can find sort of statements from her saying this is a really important issue. The crucial thing was that came out of the Berlin meeting was the so-called Berlin Mandate, which said that yes, the science is real and we're going to have to start. The rich countries are not just going to have to stabilise their emissions at 1990 levels by 2000. That's not enough. The rich countries are going to have to start to reduce their emissions. Now, within the UNFCCC, signed in 1992, there was an understanding that the poor countries in the world shouldn't have to bear the burden of emissions reductions because it was the rich countries that caused this problem. Now, of course, at that time, China was counted as a poor country, and one of the issues over the last 30 years is, can you still count China as a poor country? But I'm digressing. So through gritted teeth, the rich countries signed on to the Berlin Mandate, and there's a great book which I should have mentioned earlier called The Carbon War by Jeremy Leggett, and what you see in that book is the really sneaky, nefarious efforts by both American industrial interests, oil, coal, gas, automobiles, within this thing called the Global Climate Coalition, but also the Middle East oil and gas producers who really didn't like the idea of a treaty that reduced demand for their product. And they were behind the scenes doing everything they could to weaken, to water down. So in 1997, in Kyoto, a deal was reached, the Kyoto Protocol, and it was absolutely piss weak, nowhere near what the scientists were saying needed to happen, but a deal. Australia got a super duper double exemption, both for land clearing and differentiation, but I could go on for hours about Australia, eh? I won't. And the dynamic that you saw after Kyoto was that, at last we've got a treaty that starts the ball rolling for actual emissions reduction. So lots of the big NGOs, the Greenpeaces and Friends of the Earths and so forth of this world, were reluctant to really slam the Kyoto Protocol because, well, at last we've got the Americans on board, and at last, You know, we've got the Australians more or less on board, even though their reduction is an increase, but we'll pretend we didn't see that. And, you know, let's hope. So things kind of dragged on for a few years, and then George H.W. Bush's son became the President of the United States, and one of the first things that happened is he went back on his election promise to do something about climate change. You see a pattern emerging here, and he pulled the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol in March 2001, and was followed in June of the following year by Prime Minister John Howard of Australia. And the rationale was always, well, why should we hurt our economies, predicated that carbon reductions would automatically hurt economies. Certainly they'd hurt the coal producers and some of the more recalcitrant car companies, but you know, those aren't the entire economy now, are they? They're the bits that matter. So the Kyoto Protocol looked dead in the water. But eventually, because in order for the Kyoto Protocol to become law, you needed a certain proportion of the people, of the nations to sign up to it. And without Australia and without the United States, that looked quite tricky. Eventually, the Russians came on board, and everyone assumes, and I think maybe someone has proven it, that the Russians did it as a quid pro quo. We will sign your Kyoto Protocol and we might be able to make some money out of it, as long as we get admission to the World Trade Organization. And this happened. In February of 2005, the Russians came on board, the Kyoto Protocol became a thing. And there was supposed to be development money, the Clean Development Mechanism, all these TLAs, three-letter acronyms that keep bureaucrats busy, but frankly don't achieve very much of anything, if at all. But of course, the Kyoto Protocol, which was only supposed to run between 2008 and 2012, and the clock's ticking. It's already taken them many years to get it ratified. So very quickly, the problem becomes what's going to replace it. So they had one of these conferences of the parties, COPs, in 2007 in Bali in Indonesia, and they came up with a roadmap, because there's always a roadmap, isn't there? You know, that in 2009 they would sign a new treaty, all singing, all dancing, and that we'd really be heading in the right direction. And that treaty would include sort of mitigation, adaptation, technology transfer, and finances, as I recall. And so there's this high-intensity 2-year game of chicken, where everyone's thinking they're going to, or some people think they're going to make it. And the meeting was held in Copenhagen, and the Danish really think that they are all that when it comes to hosting sort of consensual meetings. They're not, but they think they are. So Copenhagen was a failure, I think it's fair to say, and all that came out of that was this totally vacuous Copenhagen Accord, which was sort of the leavings of the floor and the bits of dead body and so forth. And by now, the environmentalists had rocked up, and they were doing their polar bear things and their ice sculpture things and their mass marches and talk of how we're going to build an international mass movement, blah-de-blah-de-blah, and it was just more summit hopping. But I digress. Okay, so I should say that through all of this process, the emissions keep climbing. And through all of this process, the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere keep climbing. So it's easy to get lost in, you know, the fine words and the fact that the amount of renewables has gone up by, you know, 300%. But you have to say to yourself, well, what was the baseline from which it's gone up 300%? What percentage of the world's energy needs, as opposed to electricity needs, are being met by hydro, solar, wind? And it's pitiful. It's within the statistical error bar throughout all of that time. It's changing a little bit in the last few years, but okay. So they realise that they're going to still have to have some sort of international process. And then the French get hold of it and they say, well, we'll hold the 2015 meeting, and we are all that. The Danish think they are, but we are. So there's this sort of Copenhagen redux. And then eventually, in November 2015, we get the Paris Agreement. And there is this sort of big, huggy, mutual congratulation, backslappy moment. And it's just bobbins. I mean, Naomi Klein made the point that the word fossil fuels doesn't appear anywhere. Lots of the things that the small nation states wanted just get ignored. But one thing that does happen from the Paris Accord, where all of the nations have pledged that they'll do X or Y or Z, INDCs they're called because it's a four-letter acronym, so it's 33% better. If all of the nations did the things that they said that they would do, which of course is not going to happen, you'd have a global average temperature rise of between 2.5 and 3.5 degrees, which will be catastrophic. Okay. But the interesting thing that came out of Paris, the unexpected sort of Easter egg, is that in order to get all of the small countries, which had been saying since the beginning of the negotiations in sort of 1989, we're small island states and the sea level rise will wipe us out, do something. In order to get those countries to sign on to this Paris Agreement, one of the major concessions was that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had been set up in '88 and had been part of the American effort to, if not subdue, and then at least have some control over the scientific process. This is, again, in the aftermath of the ozone thing that they didn't like. The IPCC was asked to produce a report about what it would take to hit a 1.5 degree warming target. Now, I'm pretty sure if you are, and so they went to work because they're diligent scientists and that's what they do. Now, I'm pretty sure if you asked anyone before that report came out, what will happen to it, how much media attention will it get, how much cultural traction will it get, they'd have laughed at you and said, well, we know the answer to that question because we've run this experiment dozens, hundreds of times, and a special assessment report might get a few days of media coverage, but only in the left-leaning liberal press, and otherwise we'll just sink without trace because some celebrity will leave his or her husband, or some footballer will score a wonder goal, or whatever. But the IPCC's 1.5 degree report happened to come out at the end of an extremely hot summer in the Northern Hemisphere, after sort of the students had started striking in the United States, after Greta Thunberg had started her, at that time, one-person strike in Stockholm. And my God, the thing got traction. And people have read it. And people have gone, holy heck. I'm not going to swear because this might be seen by some kids. Kids, your parents have betrayed you, you're doomed. Anyway, so where we're at now is, of course, Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. The Australians have, in effect, done the same. So this is just Kyoto, the sequel, but as with all sequels, the deaths are more elaborate and the body count is higher. It's really hard to have any hope whatsoever. We've had 30 years of failure in the international climate negotiations. There have been intermittent efforts by publics, often sort of the big NGOs, to mobilise. But it's just a symptom of the broader difficulties of governance generally, but also governance of an issue like climate change, which is a super wicked problem, and you can look that up. Elements of it include the fact that sort of responsibility is diffused, that the consequences are uncertain and in the distant future. There used to be... Anyway, I'm going to stop now. If you have any questions about the UNFCCC process that you think I might be able to answer, you can email me. I edit something called Manchester Climate Monthly. I think I said that at the outset. McMonthly, MCMONTHLY.com. The Twitter handle is at MCR_climate. and thanks for watching.